Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is our chronologically first episode of Keeping Tabs on Chemistry. In this video, we are going to be discussing the nature of science and what chemistry is. So, the big overarching question to start this off is what is science? So, science is the concerted human effort to understand or to better understand the history of the natural world and how the natural world works. So, this includes a lot of different categories. So, all the way from Earth history, looking at fossils and fault lines and geography, to biology, the study of life, to chemistry, the study of matter, and finally physics, the study of forces. So the way that we study science, it's done through observation, looking around, seeing what's happening, or experimentation where we manipulate what's going on. So we observe natural phenomena and we experiment to simulate natural processes under controlled conditions where we are in charge of those variables. So then what is the nature of science? The nature of science, abbreviated NOS or NOS, is the process of how scientific knowledge is gained. This is the how of science. So there are 7 tenets of the NOS. So a tenet is a statement of principle, not to be confused with a tenant, which is someone who lives in like an apartment or under a landlord. So tenet, Tenet. So, the 7 tenets of the nature of science. The first one is that the natural world is understandable. Right? This is kind of an obvious assumption for us to make. In order for us to believe that we can understand the world around us, we have to believe that the natural world is in fact understandable. The second tenet says that science is based on evidence. Now, this is both observations and inferences. A little later in this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about the difference between observations and inferences. The third tenet says that science is a blend of logic and innovation. A lot of people think of scientists as very straightforward, methodical people, and they're right, but they kind of don't see the creative side of scientists. And if you think about it, when we're sitting here in high school science classes, the labs and things that we're doing are what we call cookie cutter. You have a procedure and you follow it step by step, but that's not really how science is done. If I'm a scientist and I'm out there researching cancer cells, for example, I don't know the procedure, I don't know the answer before I start. I have to use my own kind of innovative thinking to figure out how am I going to study this? What am I looking for? What can I manipulate? And if I don't have the equipment or the equipment doesn't exist to do that, I have to build it and create it myself. So that's where we get that kind of creative side of science. The fourth tenet says that scientific ideas are durable, yet subject to change as new data are collected. Science is absolutely not set in stone. Right? So the principles that we come up with, we're pretty sure that are right. They are durable, we have tested them, the evidence that we have supports our conclusions. However, as we get new information, as we get those new pieces of equipment and new experiments going on, as we collect new information that contradicts our previous thoughts, we have the flexibility to change and adapt our theories and laws to fit the new evidence. The fifth tenet is that science is a complex social endeavor. This is often overlooked, yet you all know examples of where science is influenced by society. Scientists are funded by governments, so politics play a big part in it. Society and their acceptance of different types of science, like stem cells and other types of things, all of that controls what we can look into, what we can research, how we go about doing it. The sixth tenet says that scientists try to remain objective and engage in peer review to help avoid bias. Right? So, to be objective means that no matter who is conducting the experiment or who's looking at, what we're looking at, we all come to the same conclusion. To be subjective means it kind of depends on who's reading or who's looking, who has the opinion. So, objective means it's based on the object, not on the subject. So, we try to remain objective and avoid our bias by using a peer review process. So, the whole point of science is to publish articles, to publish your research, to get that information out there. But before you can do that, other scientists around the world are going to look at your experiment and your data, and they're going to try to recreate it, right? That way, somebody independent of you and whatever bias or social pressure that you have can look at it and confirm, yes, this is valid. We've gotten into a lot of trouble when articles are not peer reviewed and they get out into the public. The biggest example of that is the vaccines cause autism conspiracy. This was published by a doctor who said that he had evidence that administering vaccines caused autism in children. And it was later revealed that he was not peer reviewed, he had manipulated his own data. It was basically a big hoax, and he lost his medical license over the debacle. But by that point, it was too late. It was out there, and you can see it's kind of perpetuated throughout time, even to now. And that was over a decade ago that that had happened. So we try to remain objective, we engage in peer review to avoid those situations. The seventh tenet, science is collaborative. This one is probably the hardest for students to accept. You think about a scientist as being in a lab, alone, doing their work, and in a way we are. A lot of the times, being a research scientist is a pretty lonely thing. You're kind of in your own research lab, you see your own group of people. However, it doesn't mean that there's not communication involved, and it ties in with that peer review. Scientists are constantly building off each other, sharing their information, going to conferences, talking to each other. It's a very communication and collaborative endeavor to study science. So those are the seven tenets of the nature of science. And it's kind of hard seeing them on paper to envision how it all works. So throughout the year, we're going to try to show you how we go about doing this. We're going to talk about how scientists in the past have shown examples of this, and we'll kind of envision it that way. So, what is the difference between a theory and a law? I ask this every year and I always get the same answer from some brave soul who's not afraid of me on the first day of school. Somebody always says that a theory is not proven, and when it eventually has enough evidence, it becomes a law. And that is 100% false. A theory does not become a scientific law, ever. It doesn't happen. It is not a process. It is not a from here to there. They are two separate things. They're related to each other, but they don't go between, right? There's no transformative process here. So let's look at the difference between a theory and a law. So here we have this chart. So we're going to start with what they do. So a theory explains a relationship. Much like the nature of science, it usually comes in a series of tenets, some statements for an explanation. And it can be modified at each tenet as we get that new information. So say we figure out that this one part of it was wrong, we can change that one part and leave the rest of it. So some examples are the kinetic molecular theory, which we're going to talk about a lot this year, which is the theory that explains how molecules move. And then you might be familiar in physics with the theory of relativity and time dilation and all those things from Einstein. Now, a law does not explain, a law states a relationship. Usually, a law is math, it's an equation, right? So that we can predict what's going to happen based on how we know we've seen how it goes, so we can use math to make predictions about it. So these are not modified but scrapped entirely and start over. So sometimes we can add adaptions to it, but by adding adaptions into math and correction factors, you basically change the entire equation. So instead of saying we modify it, we scrap it, we build a new one, right? A new equation, new math. So some examples of that are Newton's laws of gravity, right? What goes up must come down. And then we're going to talk about the ideal gas law this year, which describes how gases behave in terms of pressure, volume, number of moles, which we'll get to, and temperature as well. So, what theories and laws have in common? Both are supported by lots of evidence. Get rid of that notion that a scientific theory becomes a scientific law. It doesn't happen that way. Both can be used to predict outcomes, one based on the how, the other is based on trends, and then both are widely accepted by the vast majority. Notice it doesn't say everybody. Theories are not always accepted by the entire populace, but science is based on the popular consensus. The vast majority confer, they agree, and that's what we base on. Now, the people who dissent, they keep doing their experiments to try to disprove. And that's where we get into durable but can adapt to change. So, an observation versus an inference. Not everything is done through experimentation, especially in parts of science like biology. We go out into nature and we observe things. So, observation is determined by your five senses. It's something that you can touch or smell or taste or see or hear. Those kinds of things are observations. It's very straightforward and factual. Now, in chemistry, we'll use touch, we'll use smell, we'll use sight, we'll use hearing. We don't use taste, typically. Uh, Tasting a chemistry experiment is never a good idea. But we'll get to that when we talk about safety. Now, an inference is some conclusion made based on your observations. An inference pulls on your previous experience, what you know that this means. So, for example, here are some observations and the inferences you can draw from it. You can walk in the woods and see this footprint has 5 toes. You can then infer from size or shape and those things that a bear has made those footprints. Now, an observation, the plant has wilted, you infer that nobody remembered to water that plant because you know that if plants don't have water, they wilt. An observation, the boy is smiling. You see the boy smiling, you then infer that the boy is happy because in your mind, smiling equals happy. So here, if we're looking at this photograph, take a moment and in your own head make one observation and one inference. So, a really common thing that people tell me is for an observation, they say the iceberg or the ice cap is melting. Okay? That is not an observation. That is an inference, right? You are inferring, oh, it's a polar bear on the ice cap. I know that the polar bears are in danger because the ice caps are melting, so that ice cap must be melting. That is an inference. An observation you would see is that it's a small ice cap. The bear is holding on to it. There's more water around there than ice. Things like that are observations, and you infer based on your previous knowledge. So we're going to take a moment and you are going to do some observation and inference practice. All right, now that you've had a chance to do that, we're now going to look at the answers for this. So the temperature of the glass of water near the window is warmer than the glass on the shelf. You can infer that the sun has heated the water through the window. Now the milk must have been in the refrigerator. I must have felt that the milk is cold. If the tulips are blooming, it must be spring. If it must be dismissal time, the bell rang. I heard the bell ring. It must be dismissal time. Now the clouds are very dark. I can then infer it's going to storm. Now these don't have to be exactly the same, but you should have come up with something along these lines. Okay, the big question here, what is chemistry? That's kind of what we're here for, right? This is chemistry class, so what is chemistry? Chemistry is the study of composition, structure, and properties of matter and the changes it undergoes. So, what is matter? Matter can be defined as anything that has mass and has volume. So, mass is the quantity of matter in a substance and it's measured with a balance. And then volume is the amount of space that an object occupies. So, something that has substance and takes up space. That is the realm of chemistry. So we study chemistry and all sciences using the scientific method. So the scientific method is the process of studying natural phenomenon and it uses the following steps. The first step is observation of some phenomenon. And from that you form a question. So to answer your question you'll say, I think that. So it's a statement of a hypothesis. You then experiment to collect data and test your hypothesis. And from that experiment you're going to undergo data analysis and interpretation. From your interpretation, you form a conclusion. Now, most of you think, haha, that is the end. It is not the end. You have to repeat to make sure that you didn't have any bias and you get the same results over again. And not only you repeat it, but other scientists undergo that peer review process and they repeat it too. Only after that goes over a few cycles can we generate a theory or a law. Remember, a theory explains a relationship, a law states a relationship, usually mathematically. So you can come up with one or the other. Remember, a theory does not become a law, they are both proven scientific terms. So experimental design has a few components that we need to define, and you're familiar with all of these from your middle school sciences and other science classes that you've taken. So the independent variable, it is what is manipulated by you, the experimenter, in order to produce a change. So the independent is what I change, right? Starts with an I. So this appears on the x-axis when you're plotting your data. The x-axis is the horizontal bottom axis. Now, the dependent variable is what is being measured or observed in response to that independent variable. So this appears on the y-axis, the vertical axis, when plotted. So two other definitions that are commonly confused. Constants are possible variables that are kept the same throughout the experiment. So they are held constant. The control is the original experimental trial without any changes to the independent variable. Now, in biology, the control is usually pretty easy to identify. Say you're studying the height of plants and you're doing it based on how much water you give them. Your control would obviously be no water given. It's a little harder to do that in chemistry because we like to study things like temperature. So, as temperature increases, what happens to pressure? But there's no way to have no temperature. So then what's your control going to be? So when you run into situations like that, the control is whatever the trial you do first. So the original trial. So if you started at 10 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Celsius is now your control, and you're going to compare everything else to that. So it's a little different in chemistry, but the concept still applies. So we're going to pause here and you're going to do some practice looking at a chemistry example and determining the components of experimental design. All right, now that you've had a chance to look at it, uh, when we're looking for the independent variable here, the only difference in the two trials here is that we had a 1 gram piece of calcium that was whole and then a 1 gram piece of calcium that was crushed. So some of you might have said size or things like that. It's not really size. Instead, we would call it surface area of calcium. So if you said size, that's okay, but surface area is really the better term to describe that. Now, the dependent variable, what were we measuring? So it says it recorded how long the reaction took to finish. So we call that reaction time. Now, the controls, which is the original experiment, in this case, the whole piece of calcium because there was no calcium example. Then the constants, things that were held the same. Things like mass, they were both 1 gram. Temperature, they were both at 25 degrees Celsius. The type of element, calcium. The volume of water, 20 milliliters. And you can think of many, many more assumptions about what was held constant, things like where it took place and what time of day, and all those other things. So now, what do we do with that information? In chemistry, we deal with quantitative data. Quantitative data means numbers. Qualitative would be things like color and, more five senses based. But quantitative means numbers. So we use scatter plots instead of bar graphs. You will almost never see a bar graph in chemistry. We use scatter plots. So graphs are visual displays of numerical data. So the independent variable is plotted on that x-axis. The dependent variable, what you measured, is plotted on the y. Now, because it's a scatter plot, we need the line of best fit drawn so that it best fits the data. Sometimes this is called a trend line too. So the way you draw a line of best fit is pretty much you're trying to get the same number of dots above and below the line in a straight line as possible. And it's not always a straight line. We can use different types. Linear trend lines are really common, logarithmic, exponential, all those different kinds of things. Now, when we do graph and we look at graphs, we see two different types of graphical relationships. The first one is a direct relationship. This is when you're looking at two variables. As one variable increases, the other variable also increases. So as one goes up, the other also goes up. So when we see this on a graph, this is a straight line with a positive slope, right? So where both are low or they both are high, it's a positive straight line slope. Now, the opposite of a direct relationship, you guys probably said, aha, I know this one. It is an indirect relationship. Well, it's not. It's an inverse relationship. There's no such thing as an indirect relationship. It's direct and inverse. So in an inverse relationship, as one variable increases, the other one is going to decrease. So as one goes up, the other goes down. This one is not a straight line. It's either logarithmic or exponential. So you're looking at this. So as we go across the x-axis, this is getting bigger. The dependent variable is getting smaller. So as one gets bigger, the other gets smaller. It's a negative slope, though it is not linear. And that concludes our notes on the nature of science. I'll see you next time.